I'm Aaron Cosby. I'm the chair of the Commission on Carbon Competitiveness. Welcome to this webinar. Transition Accelerator, calling for a new Canadian industrial strategy. Um, I, I should start by telling you a little bit about the Commission on Carbon Competitiveness. This is a self-nominated group of folks from a number of different disciplines: trade law, economics, environmental economics, private sector, technology expertise, industrial policy expertise, who have come together to try to figure out how to foster the competitiveness of Canadian industry, especially as we go toward a net zero future. The first two reports from the Commission focused on how to avoid leakage in the legacy sectors, that is your irons, your steels, your cements, your aluminums. This third report that we'll discuss today is a bit of a pivot. We're focused on how to foster the competitiveness of those sectors which are up and coming, as well as the decarbonized pathways of the legacy sectors. So this is a report calling for a shift in how Canada does its industrial policy. We'll hear from the main author of the report, Travis Southern from the Transition Accelerator, some of the details of the recommendations and the findings of that report, including some very interesting case studies in just a moment. But on behalf of the Commission on Carbon Competitiveness, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar and pass it along to Derek Eaton from the Transition Accelerator to say a few words before we get into Travis's explanations. Derek.
Right. Thanks, Aaron. Hello, everybody. I'm Director of Future Economy at the Transition Accelerator. That's a nonprofit organization that drives projects, partnerships, and strategies to ensure that Canada is competitive in a carbon neutral world. A world, I guess, that's changing faster than many of us can fathom right now. And I'd just like to say briefly how pleased we are with this collaboration with the Commission. When Aaron came to us last fall and requested the Transition Accelerator to work on and prepare a report on industrial strategy for them, it felt as though we were finally really making progress. Our future economy team, led by our principal, Bentley Allen, who can't be with us today, has been working to advance a modern industrial policy approach for Canada to address competitiveness and prosperity challenges for a strong 5 years now. We partner with industry in a number of sectors to develop ready-to-implement pathways that solve real business and policy challenges for technologies like EVs, batteries, critical minerals, biomaterials, and carbon neutral fuels. We'll drop some links to some of this work in the chat in due course. But really, when I think about this, prejudices, misconceptions, and really even fake news still persist around the topic of industrial strategy and make it difficult for us to achieve sufficient consensus and momentum. So our hope today is that this report of ours and today's webinar will help Canada move forward to address geopolitical tensions and the new dynamic trade landscape. We need a smart industrial strategy now more than ever. So that, I guess, thanks very much. And I'll pass it right over to Travis. Is that how we're going to go?
Great. Thank you so much, Derek and Aaron. So I'm Travis Southern, Future Economy Lead at the Transition Accelerator, lead author in this report. I want to sort of take the next 15 minutes to walk everyone through what we're achieving or striving to achieve with this report. So essentially, we're discussing the elements of successful industrial policy. So we're taking those elements from a variety of cases that have done this well, not just here at home, but abroad. So very quickly, the 6 cases that we discussed in the report, and we synthesized 3 best practices from those 6 cases. So here at home, we talked about canola oil, we talked about commercial satellites, and we talked about canola oil, commercial satellites, and the third, which is now escaping me.
Oil sands. Oil sands. How could you forget the oil sands?
Yes, thank you. Important. And then abroad, Taiwan semiconductors. We looked at electric vehicles from China and Japan and Korea, and then Chilean aquaculture. So what did these 6 cases do well, and what can we learn from our own tradition of industrial strategy and global success stories? All 6 of these cases in very different country settings and very different technologies did 3 things. They targeted specific technologies over time, sticking around for the long haul. Second, they established custom coordination mechanisms between private and public sectors for that dialogue to occur. What do the firms need as they scale? If you don't have those coordination mechanisms established, you won't know. And then that leads to the third piece, which is addressing those needs of scaling firms with a broad policy mix of supporting policy instruments. So of course, R&D is at the center of all 6 of these success stories, but it doesn't stop there. And that's the key thing. It mobilizes a whole supply side and demand side policy mix. So on the supply side, you have, of course, R&D, skills, capital. But on the demand side, importantly, you have things that create demand for these technologies as they scale. So strategic use of public procurement, for example, unlocking global markets with export supports, things like setting standards so that your firm's standards are embedded in the standards of these emerging technologies. So then that just creates that market pull for those technologies that you've already scaled up through strategic use of supply side policy tools. So again, 3 things. You have to pick something. You have to coordinate with the private sector firms in that space, ongoing dialogue. And third, you have to mobilize the whole policy mix. So very briefly, why are we doing this now? So of course, we had the trade disruption, exposing reliance on US trade. You have this sort of persistent productivity and innovation stagnation in Canada that preceded this current moment for decades, where you have the OECD nations, for example, increasing business expenditure on R&D, whereas in Canada, we've had decades of flat to decline. Rather unique in that regard. So of course, when firms aren't investing in innovation, they're not producing as much output per hour worked. So productivity has been in persistent decline as well. The growth has been very slow, is a better way to put it. Now, so that erodes prosperity, it erodes living standards over time. So you're having this current moment of disruption with already weak fundamentals. Now, one of the structural features that industrial policy seeks to address is scaling up firms, specifically scaling firms in next generation technologies that have high value add. So that's key to productivity. And a shameless plug, the Transition Accelerator has also released a productivity report, how clean technologies can actually address productivity. Check out the webinar on Monday for that and our website. But so this is important. So scaling firms, we know from the data that Canada doesn't have enough scaling firms. So not startups, but actually taking technologies to scale. And that is a threat to innovation and productivity. And the report sort of takes this as a jumping off point. So at a moment where perhaps the US is stepping back from technological leadership in next generation energy technologies as the world decarbonizes, this is a growth opportunity for Canada to step in. And how do we do it? Strategic industrial strategy to scale our firms so that they are the leading suppliers in these next generation supply chains. So that's industrial policy in a nutshell. That's the goal of it. Now, the scale up problem and the technological dependence problem. These are 2 structural features that successful industrial policy addresses. We can get into them more in the Q&A. So I want to save time to go into these success stories, these 6 case studies. But very quickly, the scale-up problem, we have lithium-ion batteries that are invented essentially in Canada, particularly lithium iron phosphate at Hydro-Quebec and others, but we never scaled those firms to global success stories, from the moment of sort of invented here, scaled elsewhere from the 2000s till now. Whereas China and these other countries supported those firms to scale up that technology like CATL, BYD, to global leaders. And they used more than just R&D supports, they used strategic procurement and other demand side tools as well. And constant dialogue with those firms. So that's kind of what we're trying to get away from, is this invented here, scaled elsewhere problem. Another factor here is the technological dependence problem. So going back to the 1970s, the Science Council of Canada and others talked about this sort of issue of branch plant truncated firms, this industrial structure in Canada where you have sort of a low R&D environment, dominated by large firms with branch plants, with very low linkages to domestic firms. So again, in this environment, it's a low innovation environment. These are the things we have to overcome. How did other countries do this? Electric vehicles, we talked about this. So in China, it wasn't just offering R&D, they did, of course, but strategic use of municipal transit procurement for electric buses funneled revenue to those companies that I listed, BYD, CATL, enabled them to get through that commercialization value of death. So that's the demand side and the supply side working together. Now, targeting over time, these three countries, Japan, Korea, China, they set their sights on electric vehicle batteries decades ago. Very specific targets. So Japan, for example, 20% market share by 2030. So it's not just market share targets, but it's technologically specific performance targets that are set as well. How do they go about achieving those targets, landing on those targets? It's constant coordination dialogue with those firms. So they have entities, Public-Private Strategy Council in Japan, for example, where all the sort of government agencies involved in funding battery science, as well as the industry players, come together and create roadmaps. So that's that success story there. Same thing in Taiwan with semiconductors. So why is it that Taiwan is so good at making semiconductors? It's long-term targeting. 1974, they created ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute. It's their innovation agency, with the goal of creating a domestic supply chain in semiconductor technology. So this was the goal basically from the start. And the coordination mechanism was that innovation agency, ITRI. So what did they do? They basically diffused foreign technology through their domestic supply chain. So they brought together their firms, they led in-house R&D as an innovation lab within the government, and they combined that with foreign technology and then diffused it to their domestic firms throughout the supply chain. So they played this bridging role. Again, that's a coordination mechanism. What do the firms need? How do we best give it to them? Policy mix. So again, R&D was a key element here, but it went beyond that. Industrial policy always uses intellectual property assistance. So helping their cohort of firms negotiate intellectual property agreements, globally defend their patents. Also, they offered financial supports, domestic equity investments, export supports, helping their firms and their supply chains become essential in global supply chains, export markets. So this isn't just R&D, it goes beyond. Same thing in aquaculture in Chile. So there you have this instance where, again, in the 70s, throughout the 80s and 90s, the decision was made to shift from traditional fishing to salmon farming, high value added, high productivity. Corfo was the innovation agency there, and they sort of led this effort. So on the supply side, government R&D labs helped unlock issues that surfaced as the firms grew. So for example, fish disease control, and how to sort of achieve those R&D breakthroughs and then diffuse them through the industry. So again, that's R&D on the supply side. Then on the demand side, industry-driven standards adopted into their national law. With those R&D breakthroughs about what's needed, they embedded those into the standards and then created export supports for those firms so that this threshold of what is, a good Chilean fish product is understood globally and unlocks export markets. We did this at home as well. So the 3 cases in Canada, apologies to the oil sand folks for forgetting you off the jump. I will not do that now. So oil sands, SAGD technology, steam-assisted gravity drainage, didn't exist. So in 1974, the Alberta government set a target. So Premier Lougheed focused on unlocking this potential. And basically, from the next 10 years, through the coordination agency, AOSTRA, Alberta Oil Sands Technology and Research Authority, they used government R&D science to unlock the technology, co-funded with industry, this R&D. But importantly, it was a long-term commitment. So there was a 10-year mark from 1974 to 1984, where the fundamental breakthrough hadn't occurred. Money had been spent. Industry was hesitant to co-fund the drilling test site. So the government made the unprecedented decision at the time to 100% fund the test site. That achieved the breakthrough. Of course, industry followed after that. So it's targeting something over a long period of time. It's a coordination mechanism, AOSTRA, and then it's the policy mix. Of course, public R&D is a key feature of this story. Other stories such as canola. So again, large export industry, like oil, that really didn't become unlocked until the successful industrial policy story. So basically throughout the 60s and 70s, there was this kind of continuous coordinated R&D effort. Started in federal labs in the National Research Council. There were efforts underway at different universities to basically unlock rapeseed oil as a product for human consumption. And they did that. And so that's sort of the long-term targeting, long-term effort of this over time. But importantly, how did an industry grow up around those breakthroughs? This is the coordination body, the Rapeseed Association of Canada, now called the Canola Council. So it's a nonprofit, it's an industry association, but what it did is it acted as a neutral intermediary, sort of coordinating public R&D from the universities and the government labs, and identifying what are the next research needs, the next breakthroughs that need to happen for the industry to work. And then that helped coordinate some of that federal R&D and the universities. And then also what they did is, now that it was having those breakthroughs, how do we get farmers comfortable with this technology? Extension programs. So they coordinated with the provinces and the federal government to get that done as well. And importantly, now that we have a viable product, we have to unlock on the demand side export markets. So they worked with Agriculture Canada to basically take this R&D breakthroughs that they've had, go down to the US and get it designated with the FDA as safe for human consumption. So this unlocks global markets. They brand it canola instead of rapeseed. Again, all part of this demand side to sort of unlock the market pull for this technology. So those are sort of two success stories from Canadian history. Very quickly, satellites, commercial satellites. Again, in 1974, there was an explicit federal policy targeting this area, prioritizing domestic procurement of satellite design. So taking the federal R&D in the labs, the Richard Florida labs, et cetera, that was happening in space satellites, and a deliberate effort for all federal agencies who procure space satellites to strategically work with the Canadian suppliers to get their capabilities up to a level where they can win those contracts, or at least be competitive. So signaling what the procurement needs are in advance, constant dialogue and coordination with the industry so that they can get their capabilities to where they need to be. And then coordination across government department through the Interdepartmental Committee on Space. So again, all federal procurement of satellites had to adhere to this principle of bolstering the domestic supply chain. So these are sort of three examples, but you can see in each of them, they sort of mirror what happened in these international examples. You had consistent targeting of something over a long period of time. You had coordination bodies where basically the public and private actors specific to a technology space can be in constant dialogue. What are the needs of the firms? As those firms grow, as they expand, the needs change. That means the policy tools needed to address them change. Without those coordinated mechanisms for dialogue, industrial policy risks falling into a sort of reactive, lobbying for subsidies, all the things that we don't want, all the things that we know don't work in industrial policy. So you need to pick something. You need to have coordination with the actors in that space. And then you need to deploy the whole policy mix. So industrial policy is not spending. As a matter of fact, if it's done right, it can be very fiscally responsible. More fiscally responsible than this reactive mode where you don't really know what's needed in an industry. So how do you assess a grant application? If you're not having those coordinated, consistent dialogues with those formalized mechanisms, it leaves the state exposed. So poor industrial policy can often result in a reactive stance. So we want to avoid that. So in a nutshell, that's the report. Commit to targeting something, create coordination mechanisms, and then deploy the whole policy mix. How do you do those three things? There's some recommendations. We can talk more in the discussion about them. Essentially, first step, create a high-level advisory task force, independent expertise, transparent criteria for selecting 5 to 7 priority sectors, priority technologies. This enables the Privy Council Office and the Prime Minister to make transparent commitments to specific technology sectors. So you don't have situations where the money gets spread across various things and nothing really gets to global competitive scale. It needs to be transparent because that's, of course, public money that could be spent. Once you've established those 5 to 7 areas, coordination mechanisms, they could take many forms, but you need to designate who in this area is best networked with the private sector, has the independence. So it could be a nonprofit organization, could be a crown corporation. They need to make roadmaps with the private sector to surface those policy needs of the firms as they scale. And importantly, the third and final piece, align the policy mix across government. So cabinet level leadership is needed. You can't have situations where, a policy tool is located in a different department and it's not being optimally used. You do need some sort of centralized mechanism. It could be something like the Build Canada Committee, a cabinet level committee focused on economic policy and industrial strategy. So those are the 3 recommendations in a nutshell: to pick things, coordinate with the private sector, and then align the policy mix across government. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Travis. That was excellent. And we've got 3 really good speakers that from different perspectives to comment on the report and their perspective on the issues. But before they do, I want to draw out a couple of just brief highlights from the presentation Travis just gave us. From the starting point, we are at a moment of unique opportunity in Canadian history to take an initiative like this. We are being forced to reduce our traditional reliance on north-south flows of trade and investment by U.S. trade policy and other policies. We're forced to look for homegrown growth in a way that we were not before. We're presented with a new government that is looking for big ideas. And we are also, unfortunately, at a time of U.S. pullback from its own climate change ambition, which offers us the opportunity to capture and garner investment that was formerly going to be flowing south of the border and away from us. All of these things give us the opportunity at this point in time to look for these kinds of big ideas. And I want to stress the big ideas that this government is looking for now seem like they are primarily in terms of infrastructure projects. The stuff we're talking about here are nation-building ideas. If we look back at the history that Travis recounted, things like the growth of the canola industry in Canada, commercial satellites, and look at oil sands, these are all nation-building, prosperity-generating areas that never would have happened without active government support in Canada. And one more piece from Travis's presentation, the lessons that he has drawn from these case studies and the international case studies speak to what is needed to make this done. They also speak to the difficulty, the challenges of doing this right. We know that the history of industrial policy, both in Canada and elsewhere, is littered with failures and probably more failures than successes. So the lessons are, we need to focus on what has made the successful one successful and be tolerant of the inevitable failures when they come. I'll shut up now and let people that know more about this subject speak and from their perspectives and to the report. Let's start then with Sarah Petrovan. And Sarah, of course, can introduce herself, but let me say that she is the Vice President for Industrial Decarbonization and Sustainability at the Cement Association of Canada, a longtime advocate for decarbonization pathways in the cement sector. Sarah, what do you think? What's your take on both this report and the kinds of difficulties and support you would like to see in the cement sector going forward? I'm not hearing you right now.
All right, there we go. How about now?
I've got you now, as well as your cat. Very cute.
Yes, this is my cat Morris, who never sits on my lap unless I am presenting at a board meeting or apparently on a webinar. I'm sure he's very pleased to join us. So when I was asked to join this panel, I was asked to give, brief comments on, around 8 minutes on industrial policy and on this report. And I think it is very interesting times that we're in right now. We have Prime Minister Mark Carney delivering us all basically a masterclass in how to get shit done. And I think that's very instructive to all of us, right? We can't necessarily waste precious time belaboring the points about why we need industrial strategy. I think that we're all aligned around the idea that, we've got problems as an economy and as a country, and that these problems didn't happen overnight, right? They're the result of successive challenges and things that we've maybe done or perhaps not done over a great period of time. And this is really, time for a call to action. And so if I had to say one thing that I really wish about the report was that, while it was very thoughtful and I enjoyed reading it very much and of course vigorously agree with everything that's in it, um, I wanted more of a call to action and a really in your face direction on what we need to do next and how we get shit done. Because, I kind of look at Donald Trump as the harbinger, right? He's the sign of or the last thing that comes before, we're really in trouble. And in some ways, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm almost glad that he's kind of shown up on the scene to really kind of kick our asses and make us think more about what we're doing and how we do it. So maybe a few slides now to just kind of give visual interest to a few of the points that I want to make. So, we talk about industrial strategy, and I want to borrow my industry as an example, not only because I know it well, but in 2022, we released this report collaboratively with the Government of Canada, and it was called the Roadmap to Net Zero Carbon Concrete by 2050. And you may say to yourself, okay, Sarah, why are we talking about cement and concrete? But let me make a couple of arguments in my own defense. So nothing in this country gets built without cement and concrete, be it pipelines, wind turbines, highways, homes, etc. And so concrete and cement really are what you'd call like a strategic commodity. In many ways, like steel, we're sort of taken for granted because it's just always there, except when it isn't. And when it isn't there, how are you really going to nation build, both literally and figuratively, without it? So we created this roadmap, and it really kind of identified 3 priority areas to really advance net zero concrete and achieve it by 2050. So first was around Canadian market development, right? How do we grow the market for lower carbon cement and concrete products, right? How do we drive innovation and transition within the industry? And how does Canada become a world leader, not only in the production of lower carbon cement and concrete, but how do we become a world leader in the technology to create these products, which is important, right? And so there was a governance structure developed around it, a little bit of conversation around implementation, promises of an annual report on progress. And in total, we concluded that if we did this properly, we could achieve 15 megatons of reductions from the industry cumulatively by 2030, and of course reach net zero by 2050. And this all gave rise to the Government of Canada co-chairing the International Breakthrough Agenda around cement and concrete. So Canada co-chairs it with the UAE. There are a number of countries that are members that are globally dedicated to the decarbonization of the cement and concrete industry. And that makes sense. I think globally we're about 7% of emissions. And so, I want to kind of share a couple of observations on what I have learned from the creation of this roadmap and sort of where we've ended up. And it's really important when you're doing an industrial strategy or you're developing something that looks like industrial policy, that you define where you want to go, right? The beach matters as much as the flight. And I find that in doing this, I think what happened was, in this case, we focused a lot, collectively, the focus was too much on the flight and not enough on the beach. So what is the desired future state? And you might say, okay, well, the desired future state is net zero by 2050, but you could accomplish net zero by a lot of different ways. For example, you could have zero cement and concrete industry left in Canada. And so your industry in Canada could be net zero because it doesn't exist. Is that really what you want to have happen? Probably not. I think the other thing is that we tend to, as a country, and perhaps as governments, we always want to do more, right? We like lists, we like big lists, we like long lists. And I think it's much more important to have a few targeted, small, achievable outcomes that you can set out and then you can turn around in an annual report and say, yes, I've accomplished this. Now, some of you may have noticed the QR code on the previous slide and gone and maybe you'll review the roadmap. But one thing you will know if you do a bit of digging is that while we published the roadmap in 2022, it is now 2025 and we have published exactly 0 annual reports. I think the other thing is that, implementation matters. Defining the flight, defining the beach, defining the outcomes, none of that matters if you can't get it implemented. Implementation has to drive everything. Otherwise, no amount of policy, no amount of reports, no amounts of, working groups or anything else will really help you achieve your goals. And that's something that has really hit home for me. And then I think you just have to repeat it. You just have to repeat 1 to 3. And I think that if we had maybe shifted our focus a little bit more to these things, we may have had more outcomes to talk about in regards to our roadmap and what we've been able to achieve. And so maybe I'll just kind of conclude by giving everyone on the call sort of what I call my 3 no regrets recommendations on industrial policy, which are not dissimilar to what is in the report, but maybe goes at it a little bit more directly for the jugular. For those on the call who know me well, know that that's something that I just really like to do. And so, we have to remember that the only way that Canada is going to do anything differently is by buying things differently, right? A good friend and collaborator in the clean technology space said this to me back in 2015, and I've used it countless times since then, right? Like we could innovate and we could support R&D until the cows come home, but until we're buying our own stuff, whether that be technology, whether it be product, we're nowhere, right? There is no market. There needs to be a consumer. You have to buy things differently. I think the other thing too is that on the implementation side, like I see in the newspapers daily about how everyone's very concerned about how, Prime Minister Carney is trying to run government like a business and less like a public service. And I don't necessarily think that we should be afraid of that. I think that there are some good things that the business sector can help government in. And I think performance and KPIs matter. Like driving to outcomes isn't a bad thing. I think, it's good to have leadership within government focused on driving implementation, but we also have to remember that it's the people underneath them and the people underneath them, right? The public service is a large it is a monolith, right? And there are so many people responsible for actually, I say it again, getting shit done, that you have to kind of tie the performance metrics and the KPIs to be like, hey, if we don't deliver on this outcome, that's a problem. And so what is your part of that outcome? What is your part of that outcome? How is that put into, expectations and performance for the year? We shouldn't be afraid of driving towards outcomes and vigorously driving towards outcomes. I think finally, the one thing I'll say,
Sorry, I'm going to get you to wrap this last one up
okay,
quick,
2
just out of
seconds.
respect for the other
Encourage,
person.
And embrace failure, right? We have to learn as Canadians to accept it as the cost of doing business. And the value in failure is always what we learn from it. And so now is the time, we must learn fast and move forward. I'm done.
Thank you so much. And I think some folks, when they hear new industrial policy, are convinced that we're talking about exciting new sectors that have never been exploited before, like electric vehicles from China. Clearly not so. We can also be talking about leadership on low carbon cement in Canada. I think the next presenter will talk more in line with our expectations for new sectors that are exciting and need support to come up from across the valley of death and into commercial success. That's Marie-Pierre Eperciel, the Présidente et Directrice Générale at Prima Québec. And Marie-Pierre, I'll get you to say a few words about Prima. Before you do, can I note to participants, we will be hosting a Q&A after the three speakers. Can I get you to put your questions and answers in the Q&A function rather than in the chat? And hopefully we will have time to address them after the three speakers. Marie-Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. And it was very interesting hearing Sarah and her comments. So just allow me to begin by introducing quickly Prima Québec, which is the Advanced Material Research and Innovation Hub. Prima is what we call in Quebec a sectoral research and innovation, sectoral research cluster, and the province can count on 9 of them focused on different strategic sectors. So in a nutshell, our mission is to support and facilitate the advanced materials ecosystem by promoting, fostering collaborative innovation between firms and academics. And just to give you some quick numbers, in the last 10 years, we've supported more than 200 projects, always mixing entrepreneurs and academics, with a total value of 200 million, of which we gave almost 60 million. NSERC, and I'm insisting on NSERC, you'll know why, they gave also 55 million, which led to approximately $85 million of industrial R&D investment. So for us, it's very important. And also you have to know that for each of these projects, IP was generated, but also highly qualified people have been trained. HPQ that can be pretty much used useful for the companies who are part of the project. So back to the report, whose central contribution is, of course, to propose a principle of a Canadian approach to industrial policy. It was really a pleasure to consult it, especially since, and there was a comment by Luis Como in the chat, the net zero advisory body, which I had the pleasure to co-chair with Dan Wicklum from 2021, 2023, also did put forward some of these elements. So to begin with, the idea of targeting technologies or technology sector, of course, from our perspective, is necessary and should be done, of course, on a long-term basis, not on an electoral basis. So advanced materials should be one of them. That's what we think. Why? Well, focusing on advanced materials is crucial for multiple of reasons, but especially for the different physical functional properties, like helping reducing energy consumption, lightweight vehicle, etc. Advanced materials can enable breakthroughs technologies, enhance performance, but also competitiveness of different firms, also in the net zero approach. And we do think that targeting advanced materials is a way to, as the report mentioned, to focus on both legacy industrial sectors, but also new innovative sectors and technology that might be pretty much useful for different pathways that will bring us as a country to net zero. Also, it was interesting, I think, to pose that usually, and that you'll understand why, a nation's relative Canadian position is typically gauged usually by its finished products. We think about electric vehicles, We think about wind turbines, solar panels, clean technologies, but we do think that the most important battle must be fought upstream. You can see me coming. Advanced materials are upstream in various value chains. For example, clean tech can't exist without advanced materials. Microelectronic sector, the semiconductor, they can't exist without advanced materials. So what we tend to see is that several countries are currently focusing their strategies on advanced materials. A good example of very interesting samples are UK, the European Commission also, and well, Canada does not. But I know that there's an interest, so we'll see. And also, of course, I'm talking about, I do have some data from the Quebec part. So we do have a lot of strengths in advanced material. Ontario does, Alberta does, BC also. And from a recent study on patents, but also publication in the advanced materials sector, Canada is pretty well positioned in terms of science and patents. So from my memory, if my memories recall well, in terms of number of patent family, Canada ranks like 9th worldwide in the general field of advanced materials. So that was my comment regarding the first ingredient choosing, targeting a sector. To make a link with the second key ingredient in connection with the notion of coordination mechanism that can align industry and government efforts as the needs of innovators evolve, I just wanted to introduce you what we did in Quebec. So in 2024, with a lot of stakeholders, we chose to launch a roadmap initiative called Ambition 2035. Of course, the objective was not to tell everyone that, okay, we will reduce that amount of GHG. It was too impossible. In the advanced material, it's fragmented, if I may say so. So we try to use this kind of initiative to put people around the table. So the initiative, which was the first of its kind in Canada, was designed first to mobilize the advanced material ecosystem in the context of net zero, to further strengthen industry research links, of course, to position Quebec on the market, but also to better position the advanced materials sector as a pillar of Quebec's decarbonization objectives. So our ambition is really was to try to contribute meeting certain also major societal challenges like the energy and digital transition, but also securing different strategic supply chains by deploying concrete action in line with the vision we gave ourselves. And I will mention it later on. So really, at the basis, the roadmap was forged from a collaboration with industry, provincial government. The federal IZ was there also, a lot of researchers, SMEs, startup, bringing really together all the relevant actors for a sector. And interesting to know that this mobilizing approach rallied more than 150 stakeholders during the process, a lot of working groups, surveys, and finally, we were able to rally them around a common vision saying that by 2035, Quebec will have developed and commercialized a new generation of advanced materials along with sustainable and competitiveness processes through its committed and collaborative ecosystem. So that was the first time that we gave ourselves kind of a vision. And during all the consultation process, 7 key guidelines were drafted to support this vision. Various objectives stem from those guidelines, focusing on increasing, for example, circularity of advanced material within different supply chains, further support collaborative research boosting the emergence of startups, promoting growth of SMEs for SMEs, and all of this involving different partners that add already programs and different measures to support actors of the ecosystem and trying to, in a way, contribute to the vision they committed to. So we were able to identify different sponsors, we call them sponsors, to deploy their action and follow them through different KPIs. So we know that in the last 6 months, even though we launched the roadmap in September 2024, and last January, we launched a website to make sure that people were able to see all the actions, all the sponsor, what has been done, when it's going to be done, and etc. So we know that other actions and sponsor will add to the roadmap, and this is what we want. The roadmap is flexible, and as I think it's Travis was mentioning it, as the sector will evolve, the policy actions will need also to evolve. So, and my last comment, as for the third key ingredient to have, well, the successful industrial policy, as you mentioned, I totally agree. Of course, we can't be against the need for a pretty much a R&D focused strategy with different variety of other supporting policy instruments. For us, you have to know, as clean tech, it's very capital intensive. I mean, the specific and innovative nature of the advanced materials sector requires longer term investment, often with extended maturity periods before it can generate substantial returns. So we need some patient capital. So this sector is pretty much characterized by a long and costly technological maturity cycles. It can be between 10 and 20 years. And of course, scaling up requires significant investment in infrastructure, but also in process optimization. So to meet these challenges, we think that the current financial tool must be reimagined while developing mechanisms that bring together stakeholders in the funding chain, so investors, financial institutions, governmental agencies, in support of high potential businesses. But of all, we need to provide, as I mentioned earlier, companies with really greater access to patient capital to better support the ecosystem. And of course, if I use that's for the ecosystem, but if I talk about my day job context and the projects that we support, we really need still the federal government to support funding agencies like NSERC, because combined with our grants, it contributes to de-risk innovation, and industry puts money in the project. So it can help to increase their money in R&D. And it's very interesting because also I'd like to add that in our sector, as much as for the clean tech sector, the funding provided by STDC, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, I mean, it was also an important program that enables pilots. And I understand that since SDDC came under NRC, well, let's say that everything just has been frozen. So I think that we need to do something about that also, even though I know they had their share of problem, whatever, what we saw in the media. So in conclusion, I do agree with this kind of key ingredients, the three that you mentioned, and we need to find a way to stop probably sprinkling money in everywhere and try to focus where we do have strength and support those sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie-Pierre. I'm a terrible chair. I should be cutting people off more ruthlessly, but it's all such golden nuggets of insight that I have trouble doing that. Let me turn it over now to Sean. Sean Spear, We've heard from a legacy sector, cement. We've heard from a new materials sector. Sean does not come with a sectoral perspective. We've invited him here because he is a smart guy with deep expertise on policy space that surrounds this area. He's a senior fellow with the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's a fellow in the Strategic Competitiveness at the Public Policy Forum and editor-at-large of The Hub. He has a few other hats as well. I'm not going to name them all. Sean,
yeah, thanks, Aaron. I'm grateful to be part of today's session. One of the virtues of being a commissioner on this project is I get to see this tremendous intellectual output from afar and claim some credit by association without actually having to do the heavy lifting. It's a credit to you and the team that you're producing this timely report on an important topic. I'll be brief with my observations to permit engagement with the audience. Just a few points I wanted to make. The first is I think it's fair to say for the past 25, maybe even longer, 30 or 40 years, there has been a tendency in Western economies, including Canada, to mostly defer to markets on the geographic distribution of production. It's fair to say that, that there are people on both the left and the right revisiting that default assumption. The experience of the pandemic, where there were certain, I think it's fair to characterize as strategic goods or products that we had difficult time accessing, in addition to some of the broader economic and geopolitical developments occurring around the world, is causing people to say, well, no, there are some instances where we ought not to defer to markets on the geographic distribution of production, where it is in our national interest in a way that transcends economic calculus or market forces to either have that production within one's borders, or at least to have reliable, safe supply from allied countries. And that is contributing to this broader discourse around industrial policy and the role of government to shape markets, not merely defer to them, in which this paper finds itself. The paper talks a bit about a framework for making those judgments, trying to depoliticize the process and create some constraints around policy making when it comes to which sectors or technologies to target. Those judgments are, of course, terribly important, in addition to some of the quantitative ones that were raised around R&D intensity and patents and so on. I think there probably is room for a qualitative lens that asks the question, as I say, are these goods or products that have a strategic implication in an increasingly bifurcating world? Do we want, for instance, the capacity to be able to refine and process particular minerals in Canada for national security reasons? And if so, what is the role of policy to augment markets, to change the economics of those private decisions? And so, as I say, I think ultimately for an industrial strategy or industrial policy, you'll want that combination of empirical, quantitative measures in addition to some qualitative ones. And the reason why that framework is so important, having previously worked in the government, is I worry, Aaron, that if we don't put some constraints around this, if there is no limiting principle, one could envision different sectors and companies and so on coming to government arguing that they themselves ought to be in such an industrial policy or industrial strategy. As the last speaker said, the risk of that is it essentially falls apart, that at that point we are making public investments in different industries or companies not based on some type of objective criteria, but on the impulses of politics and other calculations. So getting that framework right strikes me as one of the most important contributions of the paper. The second is to advance the conversation from a narrow conception of industrial policy as a series of direct financing tools, whether that's grants or loans or some other types of financing instruments to thinking more broadly about a range of supply and demand side policies. I note, for instance, that something like a regulatory sandbox that would enable emerging industries or technologies or pre-existing ones to experiment with new ways of doing things that may find themselves outside of current or contemporary regulatory frameworks is an example in my mind of an industrial policy that is not so much an active instance of the government directly financing a company or directly financing a technology, but creating the policy space for the private sector to experiment and iterate. I also like the idea of trying to of using policy levers to facilitate greater cooperation or coordination between through the supply chain. Although I think there has been some successes and failures with respect to the superclusters policy, conceptually, I think there is something to government trying to support that type of coordination or cooperation across the supply chain. And so it may not look precisely like superclusters, but the U.S. model of the manufacturing institutes, for instance, I think has shown some promise. So the second point just to make is as policymakers and industry leaders and others are thinking and talking about industrial policy, a major contribution in the paper is to take a broad lens to what the different policy tools in the policy toolkit might look like with respect to industrial policy, and not get hung up on this idea that if it's not a direct subsidy from government to company, it is not industrial policy. That not only, I think, elicits resistance or opposition in certain circles, it also fails to understand the successes rooted in the case studies outlined in the paper, which were far more than mere transfers or grants from government to private entities. I particularly like the canola and oyster example because I think as someone who's traveled in conservative circles who work for Stephen Harper's administration and has, admittedly a constrained view about the role of government and its relationship to markets, I can wholeheartedly support those two particular instances precisely because they're supporting nascent technologies and working with industry players well before market development or market commercialization. In a way, those were key enabling investments and a broader set of policy supports that supported the development of nascent technologies that then could be commercialized and pulled into a more conventional market framework. So I laud the partners for doing a deep dive on those two case studies, and they're ones I think that really should be front and center when we're thinking and talking about what a modern industrial policy looks like. They also, just by happenstance, have the benefit of being multi-partisan or bipartisan instances of governments of different stripes using different types of policy tools to support the development of nascent domestic technologies. If I have two constructive criticisms or comments that I think not just the authors of the paper, but those who are intending to move forward and make the case for bringing expression to the ideas in the paper. The first is the issue of state capacity. Having spent time in the Canadian government for almost a decade, I interacted with some of the best and brightest people in the country, but there are a set of institutional forces and factors that can inhibit a government's ability to think horizontally. And of course, a lot of these ideas involve drawing on policy tools that reside in different government departments, and yet we have a system that is organized legalistically on the departmental level. So the idea of coordinating committees, I've written positively myself about leveraging the U.S. Domestic Policy Council model that resides in the White House and can enable that type of horizontal perspective and cooperation. But I do think we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize that state capacity is a crucial precondition to bringing expression to something like this. And while I think we have reason to feel good about public administration in Canada generally, we've also been exposed over the past 10 or 20 years to real limits on the state's capacity to deliver on something as sophisticated as the industrial policy envisioned in the paper. And then the last subject I just wanted to raise is the one of public choice. I broadly support the spirit and the ideas set out in the paper, but I think we have to recognize that there is that this type of policy is being carried out in an environment that even as one tries to set it up in the most objective and empirical and evidentiary-based way, necessarily involves a set of political trade-offs and political actors and various players motivated by self-interest. James Buchanan won a Nobel Prize precisely for drawing attention to these dynamics. And so I think you have to shoot through an industrial strategy, a public choice lens. You can't eliminate those risks, but you can mitigate them. And I think things like the advisory panel is part of that story, getting that criteria right, and making it transparent and public such that you can plausibly argue that you're in the plan, you're outside of the plan for the following reasons. It's crucial to protecting something like the industrial strategy set out in the paper from the natural tendencies towards regional balance and industrial balance and all the various factors that go into policymaking in a democratic society. So with that, congratulations to everyone who's contributed. It's a crucially important paper at an important moment where, as I say, these conversations are occurring across the political spectrum. But if I had one major contribution, it's that getting some of those details right, it strikes me as crucial to protecting something like this from the pressures that this type of more active role for policy inevitably faces.
Thanks very much, Sean. I should say before I say anything that one of the hats that I neglected to mention that Sean wears is, as he said, member of the Strategic Advisory Council to this commission. So that's a rather important one. I probably should have included there. And thanks also for your caveats at the end on state capacity and public choice. That, of course, informs some of the recommendations that we've made about how to structure this thing, but which form important caveats about how difficult it is to get this stuff right. And believe me, the government outreach we've done on this report has focused very intensely on how you do that, what kinds of mechanisms we can put in place to ensure that those problems are addressed. And it's still an open question, but I think you've drilled to the heart of what those challenges look like. I'm going to pass it over now to the Vice Chair of the Commission, by Vice Chair Michael Bernstein, who unfortunately has injured himself in a bicycle accident yesterday and is not going to make a public appearance on this call, but he's with us very much in spirit. I'm passing it over now to Marissa to moderate a question and answer session, both with the panelists and with Travis. If you could, I know there are some excellent questions already in the Q&A. If you put them in there, we know we will deal with them. There are also some in the chat, but by preference, let's use the Q&A. Marissa, take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks to the panelists for such an interesting discussion. So yeah, we have some time for questions. Please put them in the Q&A box and I'm going to feed them to the panelists as long as we have time. So the first one actually that appeared here is how do you pick projects if there's no strategy published to ensure that those projects actually advance the industrial strategy? So I think that question really, from a broader context, refers to or references the need for transparency and public accountability, which certainly I think relates to some of the comments that Sean mentioned at the end there, and but also Sarah's framework of setting objections and making sure to achieve them. So I think I'm going to hand this back to Travis first to see what the report says about this, but then I'd be interested to hear our speakers comment as well.
Thank you, and thanks for the wonderful feedback from all the panelists. So this is an important question because how do you pick projects if there's no strategy published? That's in a nutshell, the problem in Canada is because we're not doing proactive industrial strategy in strategically targeted technologies, and then coordinating with those firms in those technologies to surface what their needs are, and then delivering the policy mix to address those needs as those firms evolve and grow. We're in this reactive mode where we are assessing project by project, application by application to these kind of broadly focused programs or grants and contributions or other types of application-based programs. But if there's no overarching strategy to see how this project fits into achieving a technologically specific goal, Japan, for example, 20% market share in lithium-ion batteries by 2030. They have performance-based technological thresholds that they hope to achieve in benchmarks. So it's pretty easy at that stage to tell if a project is aligned with the strategy. But if you haven't built the strategy, it's a very difficult challenge. Now, of course, we're flying the plane and building it at the same time, so we can't just wait till we have these 5 to 7 priorities and then for each of them establish the coordination mechanism to come up with the roadmap that is the actual strategy. There are existing programs that shouldn't be shut down, and they're important, and they have to assess project by project. And so the Transition Accelerator, for example, we have a report we put out with Macdonald-Laurier Institute on project prioritization. So is the project in line with an existing strategy? Hopefully you have one. That's the very first question. Then there are other questions. Are there regional cluster linkages? Does this project, if it's a foreign direct investment, for example, does this link with domestic firms as suppliers into it, or customers, or technology transfer opportunities, R&D collaborators? There are a series of other benefits that you can assess a project on. And I'll sort of stop talking for now.
Thank you. That's helpful. Sarah or Marie-Pierre, more comments from you on this question? I'll move on to the next one then. Oh, sorry, Marie-Pierre, do you want to jump in?
Well, of course, I'm talking from the Quebec perspective. We don't have a specific industrial policy. Well, maybe there's innovation zones very focused on different strategies. Advanced materials are everywhere. How do you pick project when it was probably easier for Quebec because advanced materials are also supported in a big strategy, the innovation and investment stratégie québécoise de recherche, research, innovation, and investment. Well, it's a big strategy where my organization is funded, gets funding money from that. We try to link different strategies with different sectors to make sure that in the end there's the notion of silos, I think it was Sean that was meant, well, it made me think about that, but I think it's yeah, I'll stop my comment here.
Thank you.
I mean, maybe Marissa, I'll just say, so like, how do you do it when you don't publish a strategy? Well, you publish a strategy, right? Like, so, I mean, we've seen the Carney government do this, right? So, everyone's talking right now about the grand bargain, right? What are these nation building projects going to look like? The government has clearly established criteria on, what those projects need to look like and how those projects, what criteria they have to follow. So in some ways, I think the answer is right in front of us.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. It actually came up in a couple of comments from our speakers today, which is about this idea that we shouldn't sprinkle support broadly everywhere, but target certain sectors and kind of stick with them. But also on the other side, I think Erin was mentioning it, there might be inevitable failures. So is a fear of risk holding Canada back? So how can we get past a kind of maybe a more risk-averse mindset to actually start making some hard choices and stop spreading the peanut butter too thin, but focus on specific sectors, specific technologies? Be interested to hear comments.
maybe I'll go first on this one.
Yeah, go
That's okay
first.
with you, Marissa?
Go ahead.
So I think this is always a tricky one, right? How do you develop a culture of failure, right? And I think the thing is that you need, number one, we need to stop thinking about it as failure, but we need to start thinking it as a learning opportunity, right? And learning opportunities are important when you're trying to get something done, right? And we are all starting from the premise that we need to get something done. And I think, I think it's important that we not be afraid of failure, that acknowledging the failure. And I think we're starting to get there, right? So not to get overly political, but I'm from Ontario. Our premier is probably like the poster child for not being afraid to admit that he screwed something up, rightly or wrongly. We could certainly always have that debate, but I mean, publicly, he's kind of making apologies fashionable again. And it's like, hey, like we screwed up. We learned from this. Here's what we're going to do differently next time. And it's not like, oh my God, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We're going to pivot and we're going to try something different. And so I think being transparent about what you do differently and what you learned is important, right? It's not a culture of failure, it's a culture of learning. How do you get strategic? How do you pick, I think the other thing is that we have to get away from this nomenclature around winners and losers, right? It's not about picking winners and losers. It's about understanding, like, if we're building the strongest economy in the G7, what do we need to do that? So we've got these like high growth potential industries, right? You guys on page 37 finally named some of them. Travis, I really wish you got to it sooner, but maybe next time. But there are also like other industries that you will need to shore up, right? To say like, okay, well, these still need to exist in some ways because they're part of the supply chain for these industries, or to get this, you need that, right? Which is where, I think some of the report and some of what Marie-Pierre was trying to talk about, right? Where it's like there are like supply chains are strategic and intermediate materials are strategic, and you have to think about those things. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I totally agree on what Sarah said. And I do think I would have the fact that we can't sprinkle money everywhere. And it's hard to say we have to make choice. And just for example, currently we're working on a study to better understand, it's in Quebec, the value chain starting from critical minerals, because I saw there's a lot of people commenting on that. Critical minerals through advanced materials, and then how they can how they are useful to microelectronics and photonic industry. So we'll see how, for instance, Quebec is strong compared to rest of Canada and around the world. We won't choose to invest where we don't have a critical mass or expertise from a research side or the firm size. We have to choose where we want to put the money. I'm not talking about choosing winners or losers. Let's work on our strength and make sure that we can help that sector to go further, So, and the last comment, I really like the culture of failure. I hate it. The culture of learning, as you were mentioning, Sarah, I think that we need to hear this more and more. And it's very interesting because in the investor sector in Quebec, for instance, when I go and meet with some of the people, I mean, they try to have this approach, the American approach, where you fail, fine, you learn from that, and you can, a serial entrepreneur will try to be better next time. I think that we have to encourage that more instead of saying of promoting the culture of failure. Yeah.
Thank you. Travis, do you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, very quickly. So, one of the things the report really tries to achieve is this emphasis on approach versus outcome. And so a lot of the times when industrial policy is discussed colloquially, people say, well, picking winners, which winners? It's the immediate burning question, who's in and who's out. And I think, the report tries to step back and look at the historical examples of success and say, it's not about picking, it's not about subsidies, it's not about a specific policy tool. It's about a dialogue over time with a particular technology space. So with the state and the firms and the experts and the academic experts as well in that technology space, as granular as you can, having that dialogue about what's needed as the technology is scaling, that's the approach. And unless you have that sort of approach, you're in this reactive space where you're trying to basically ascertain whether a project should or should not get support, whether a sector should or should not get supported, whether a grants and contribution program should focus on X versus Y. It's cart before the horse, if you will. So, and again, the key element here is that it's coordination. It's layering coordination onto the existing policy mix. So it's not eliminating, sector-specific programs or programs that are sector neutral, or crown corporations that are in charge of a specific policy tool, like finance, for example. It's how do you take that existing policy mix and these useful tools that we've built up over the last few years and actually make sure they touch down in a specific sector, in a specific technology space to meet those needs of those firms that you're learning as they evolve because you're talking to them. So it's coordination, not spending. That's the sort of key point of the report and the successful ingredients across all these 6 case studies. And in a way, that's why the report is a bit silent on which sectors should be in or out. It's more about process. It's more about independent expertise in the advisory panel, creating criteria. So we offer a few criteria that might be useful, but ultimately the transparent criteria for selection of these priority areas needs to be done in an independent expertise way. And then also the report mentions the 5 to 7 priority areas, they should evolve. There should be off-ramps. If technologies don't necessarily pan out, bring in more. And so by creating this sort of approach that's flexible to have specific conversations in specific spaces and then coordinate the policy mix, it's actually a low commitment. It's not picking or not picking. It's actually just deciding to have a deeper coordination conversation in a few specific areas and let those areas evolve.
Let me pick up on that concept of coordination for our next question, which is maybe I'm going to primarily ask Marie-Pierre, but others, of course, feel free to jump in as well. How does the paper's suggestions around building this industrial strategy infrastructure best work in tandem with provinces are doing in that field? As for example, Quebec, how can coordination happen between these 2 layers of governance in Canada?
Provincial versus federal?
Yeah. How can these infrastructures work most effectively together?
I'm just trying to find. Just please rephrase the question just to make sure I really understand it. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So the paper suggests this industrial strategy infrastructure at the federal level, but then of course provinces are active in that space as well and have their own activities. So how do you see those most effectively working in tandem? Maybe from your perspective from Quebec.
From my perspective, I would say that first of all, and it's very interesting, and I'm going to give the example when I used to work for NZAB, okay? I was really at the federal level with federal departments. Back to my day job, provincial organization, provincial departments. It's not always easy to make sure that we can all work together. So for me, from my perspective, and it's always has been like that, we need to work with people, not with departments. So it's through people that we try to, and that's my way, we try to convince people from the federal level to make sure that we can work with the provincial level. That's what I have in mind first, on top of mind. But I think that as a country, we must find a way to work closely together. And as for the critical mineral strategy, I know that Quebec has a strategy and the NRCan, the federal has one. And I know that people are working together, trying to do something good. Communication, collaboration, that's what I would say. And that's what I have on top of mind. I don't know if it answers well, but that's what I have in mind.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you. Sarah, Travis, do you want to jump in on that question of collaboration between governments?
Other than just to say it's important, and the case studies, a lot of the canola story is intergovernmental coordination, again, facilitated through that independent intermediary. Same thing with, certainly the decentralization of, the Austria example in oil sands. It was a provincial-led initiative. And so, I think that kind of also helps perhaps with some of the politics and the public choice concerns around industrial strategy when it's, your government in your backyard identifying an industrial strategy priority that they're confident their constituents will back. Premier Lougheed was quite targeted in saying we need to unlock the oil sands. This is an important thing for our province, so we're going to do it. That kind of decentralized, and then of course having the intergovernmental cooperation on top of that, mediated through that sort of independent intermediary, that can really work.
Thank you. Sarah, last word from you on this, or?
I don't need to vigorously agree with everything that everyone else has said. I think silence counts as agreement.
Thank you. I think there's one last question here, which I think we can wrap up pretty quickly before I'm going to hand it back to Erin for a final comment. And that is there any opportunity or point for the general public to provide input or to become involved in this process? Any final comments? We only have a few minutes left, so I ask you to be brief here, but if you have any thoughts, we'd be happy to hear them.
Should I give out Erin's email address? Is that here? Maybe.
Travis is me.
So certainly, first and foremost, Indigenous involvement in these conversations is key, right? Like, if we're going to go after technology spaces, that has implications, right for rights holders. So, are they part of from the very beginning? Are they part of these, independent assessments of where we should focus as a country? That's a key one. And then, of course, as well, you have all these other actors that are very vital to not just the initial identification in the, independent advisory council, if you will, but the coordination bodies. Once you've just landed on a technology space, are you really talking with all the folks involved, labor, the unions? Are you talking with academia, the actual sort of scientific expertise in this area? And of course, the firms. You have to always have the firms as a key part of this. And so, yeah, that's part of getting society on board, but keeping the conversation technologically specific. That's the key element here. When Taiwan's talking about semiconductors, that's the conversation that's occurring. That's the supply chain mobilizing. It's a lot of different actors, but it's all around that specific theme.
Thank you, Travis. If there are no final words from our panelists, I'll hand it back to Erin for our closing comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa, and thanks to all the panelists and Travis for a really good Q&A. So that's maybe the best I've seen for a while. And to all of those of you that have put comments into the chat and the Q&A, we did not have time to get to because there is some good stuff there to dive down into. Subject for future webinar, future report, perhaps. Let me pass it over to Derek before I close for any words from the Transition Accelerator side.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, on behalf of Transition Accelerator, thanks to all our panelists, especially everybody who tuned in and also offered such great stimulating questions. It's just been a wide-ranging and enriching conversation and discussion. And yeah, just to cap it off before we started out, I just see a growing recognition that as a country, we need to get serious about industrial strategy as a foundation for economic and growth policy to deliver competitiveness and future prosperity. So we're going to keep looking to support government, industry, and other stakeholders in that, and we'll be shortly, as a last bone I could throw out, we'll be releasing some work on how to take that forward on critical minerals, hopefully in the coming week or two. So, but thank you very much, everybody.
So in closing then, I'm going to give us a 20-minute wrap-up synthesis of the conversation we've heard up to this point. Well, okay, I'm not. I'm going to not try to sum up what we've heard, but I will echo Derek's thanks to all the panelists and to Travis and to the participants and to the Commission, of course, and Strategic Advisory Council that were such an important part of producing this report. I'm also going to, in closing, highlight maybe two things that strike me about this report. This, as much as any report we've ever produced, and I'm talking here about the Commission or other work I've done, is policy relevant at this point. There's two things about it. One, it is urgent. And Sarah started out with this in her comments. This is something that needs to start now if we're going to make it successful and urgently. Other countries are engaging in this industrial policy race with vigor, right? And second, it is it's possible to do it right, even if it is difficult to do it right. And it involves, moreover, a complete break in the traditional way that we do industrial policy. This is not a recommendation for incremental change at the federal level. This is a recommendation to do things quite differently. So it's urgent, and it involves a very different course of action. We hope we find a receptive audience for the recommendations, both within the federal and provincial governments. The recommendations are valid for all those levels of government. And thanks again to those that helped make this event a further amplifier of the messages and recommendations in that report. I wish you all a good day, and until next time, cheers.